The Drifter, an America Falls novel. Written by Scott Medbury. Narrated by Mike Manns. Episode 5, Eye of the Storm. Chapter 1. The afternoon following his departure from Bakerstown, a snowstorm hit, leaving it impossible for Ragland to do anything but hunker down in his tent until morning. The storm had passed by dawn, but light snow persisted. He ate some of the berries and nuts Simon had slipped him on his departure, then went back to sleep. Even when he awoke again late in the afternoon, he would have happily stayed in the tent where there was some semblance of warmth, but his growling stomach wouldn't allow it. With the knee-deep snow, it wouldn't be easy to hunt, but first and foremost he was a hunter-survivor, and eventually crawled out of the tent to gear up. Kneeling in the crisp powder, he reached down with a gloved hand and touched the faint impressions in the snow. Tracks. Small prints. A snowtail. Taking out the bow Rahul had made him, he tested the bowstring again to ensure it felt secure. Rahul's bow was much smaller and slender of limb than his manufactured one had been, and the string was less durable, having been fashioned from sinew. It wouldn't last as long as the Dacron string on his old one, but if he kept it dry, it would make do until he could find a replacement. Grabbing an arrow and nocking it, he followed the tracks, making sure to avoid twigs and branches that, if snapped, would alert the rabbit of his presence. He thought about Kit as he stared off across a flat piece of forest ground, searching for the animal. Ragland's mind drifted with the snow, remembering the moment she had put the necklace on. Even now, alone in the world without it, he didn't regret giving Kit his last memento of his sister. His mind flitted from that melancholy memory to his forced departure from the town. Bitterness came with it. The town's willingness to blindly ignore a genuine danger outside its walls annoyed him more than he cared to admit. So did the fact that he had let himself fall into the trap of caring too much. Ragland spotted his quarry as it bounced from behind a small bush, and he raised his bow. He drew the bowstring taut and followed his target. No, it was best he forget all about Bakerstown and its inhabitants, even Kit. He loosed the arrow, and it cut through the cold air, striking the rabbit and sending it cartwheeling in a cloud of snow. Darkness was setting in by the time he got back to camp. Sheltered from the wind, Ragland nursed a small campfire into life, and soon had the small game twisting and hissing over the orange flames. When the rabbit was cooked to his satisfaction, he pulled out the knife Rahul had given him. It still proved sharp to touch, and he prized the rabbit off the spit and waited for it to cool for a few moments before slicing meat from it and eating ravenously. The meat, though tough, tasted delicious. A hard-earned meal always did. Halfway through his meal, Ragland heard the snap of a branch behind him. With memories of the ambush he had suffered in similar circumstances just a week or so before, he dropped what was left of the snowtail, grabbed his new bow, and rose to his feet in one quick movement. With another arrow nocked and ready, he began searching the darkness. After what felt like minutes, but was in fact just a few seconds, a turkey burst from the tree line, stopped and stared at Ragland for a moment, before turning tail and speeding off into the shadows. Releasing his breath and chuckling, Ragland tossed the bow down and took up his food again. "Goddamn gobblers." He laughed and bit into the carcass with even more rabid focus. The encounter with the turkey left him feeling on edge, and, paranoia or not, the feeling of being watched settled on him. He left the fire burning after his dinner and entered his tent. He had deliberately positioned the tent closer than customary to the fire to allow some of the meager heat to swell and circulate under the canvas. He suspected the benefit was more psychological than anything, but it made him feel cozier. In the morning, when he opened his eyes, the first thing he noticed was the sagging roof. The second was the eerie silence of the snow-muffled world. He peeled open the tent and was met with several more inches of snow than had been there the night before. Grumbling, he dug around in his pack and retrieved one of the single most crucial items he had looted since the fall: waterproof coverings for his legs that would tuck nicely into his hiking boots. When he was dressed for the day, the last old man clambered from his tent and wasted no time packing it away. With his pack on his back and his bow over his shoulder, Ragland still couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. He turned his head and peered between the trees at the edge of the clearing, but still couldn't see anything out of the ordinary. "Too much time in that goddamn town, Ragland," he growled before setting off again. "You've gone soft in the head." When the sun was high overhead, Ragland settled and finished the leftover rabbit with some of the root vegetables Simon had packed for him. Thanks to the cold, the cooked food had kept well and satiated his hunger and need for nutrients. At a tiny stream, he refilled his bottle and spent some time watching the ice thaw at the edges. The simple view and sound of the babbling water comforted him. After all these years, he was still a sucker for the picturesque beauty of nature, and nothing could quite beat untouched snow in the woods. Almost a full 2.5 days out from Bakerstown, Ragland began to notice markings and signs in the forest that worried him. At first he had ignored it as wildlife, but the noises and a half-scuffed print here and there were not random enough, and he began to suspect he was being stalked. Cannibals? If so, it wasn't the moronic zombs. It could only be the smarter ones, but only one or two at the most, or he was sure he would have seen them earlier. Choosing to test his theory, he deliberately took a path through more difficult terrain, areas where a careless step would dislodge rocks or break sticks in the undergrowth. 4 hours of that yielded no reward and only served to tire him more quickly. As the sun sank in the west, he began to set up a new camp, but remained more vigilant, making a quick kill and then setting snares around the perimeter that would alert him of anyone trying to get too close. He went to bed again with a full belly of rabbit and slept so soundly that it probably would have taken a siren to wake him. More snow had fallen overnight, and it crunched under his boots as he cleared away the snares he had set, the sound muffled by the blanketed trees around him. That brought to mind the traps that Alex had mentioned he and Sang had set. While he had traveled too far to encounter any now, he hadn't spotted even one as he moved away from the town. Unfortunately, he thought that the kid had pretty much wasted his time. On the 4th day, Ragland again chose a path through the more treacherous undergrowth. His perseverance was rewarded about 3 hours after he set out. The snap of a branch, accompanied by a low cry of surprise about 100 yards behind him, saw him throwing down his pack and sprinting in an arc towards the location of the sound, an arrow already nocked and ready to shoot. Traveling with great stealth, he slowed when he thought he was parallel to the position the noise had come from. He hunkered down behind a large cedar and peered through the trees to the west. 2 figures stood next to each other, talking quietly, their hands and arms moving animatedly as they argued over something. His stalkers. They weren't cannibals. In fact, they were clothed in pristine snow gear and boots and both carried bows, not the usual choice of weapon for cannibals. If not them, though, who was it? He needed a closer look. It was easy to slip from behind the cedar and get to a large boulder another 20 feet closer. Cannibals or no, they were a threat, and as he peeked over the rock, he raised his bow and aimed at the closest of the 2 figures, pulling the string tight. He slowed his breathing and prepared to let fly as the smaller of the 2 turned their head his way. Chapter 2. "Christ," Ragland rasped, relaxing the tension on his string immediately. It was Kit. Anger at the near disaster surged through him, and he shot to his feet and stormed towards them. "What the hell are you 2 idiots doing?" Kit and her fellow traveler whirled around, their eyes wide. As he suspected from the size and shape, her companion was Alex. Both shrunk away from his ire as he closed the gap, their mouths opening and closing like fish, pulled from water. "Well?" he roared, standing over them. "We had to come find you," said Kit. "No," Ragland growled, "you didn't." "The town needs you, even if they don't know it," Kit persisted. Alex spoke up. "Kit and I figured you'd be looking for them, hunting them." "Well, you're wrong. I'm just picking up my travels where I left off, and I'll avoid the cannibals if I can. You and your town should do the same." "You wanted us to fight them before. You can't give up on us, Gramps. Not yet." Seething with anger at how irresponsible they'd been to trek alone without enough people to put up a fight if they did come across trouble, he could barely speak. He stormed past them, fists clenched. Once he had put a few dozen yards between them, he turned and pointed back the way they'd come. "I didn't give up on the town, it gave up on me. Now go home, follow your tracks. Keep the fires low and maybe you get back in one goddamn piece." Ragland shook his head, attempting to keep his composure. "Kit, after everything? Are you trying to throw your life away?" "Hey man, that's not fair," Alex said, stepping forward. "This was a joint decision." "Ah," Ragland laughed, throwing up a hand. "Joint stupidity it is, of course." Kit looked hurt, but if it meant she'd turn back with no argument, then he'd say whatever he needed to say. Alex wasn't finished. "I figured someone like you would understand." "Understand what?" "That we risk our lives for people we care about," said Kit, stepping in. "I guess we were wrong about you." Her words cut deep. Before he could reply, Kit reached inside her coat and plucked out the onyx pendant. The breath in Ragland's lungs froze. "This means everything, but not if we just give up. I figured we 3 could find these assholes, so we know when they begin their move. We have a better chance of making the town see sense if we know when they're coming." Ragland couldn't take his eyes off the black stone. The muffled silence around them seemed to cut off the rest of the world. A single snowflake drifting onto his nose stirred Ragland from his reverie. I still think this is reckless, he croaked. You two aren't built for the wild like I am. Kit tucked the stone back inside her coat and smiled. Lucky we're together then, right, Gramps? Sensing the tension had dissipated, Alex looked around, searching the trees. Hey, where's your gear? He asked. Back there, Ragland said, and pointed a thumb over his shoulder. I left it by some rocks. Heard you coming from a mile away. Not surprised. The terrain nearly broke my ankle. Alex suddenly smiled. I suppose that was deliberate? Absolutely, Ragland finished, then regarded them silently. He was silent so long, Kit started to wonder if he'd had a stroke. She was about to say so when he spoke. I guess I can hang around a little longer. But once we know when they're heading to Bakerstown, I'm on my way again, understand? They both nodded, Kit doing her best to suppress a smile. He lowered his brow. Kit, you know better than anyone how quickly things can go south. You both do exactly what I tell you when I tell you, got it? Got it, they both replied in unison. Ragland paused again, hands on hips, and looking at the snow on his feet, wondering if he was doing the right thing. Misgivings aside, he felt like he had unfinished business with the town and the people in it. So for now, yes, it was the right thing. So, Kit prompted, adjusting her backpack, a hopeful glint in her eyes. What's the plan? My gear. Ragland turned and walked back towards where he dropped his pack. The two followed him. I've been looking out for signs, but so far nothing. I think they'll be coming from the east again, so we'll head that way. And then what? Kit asked. Then, the drifter explained, navigating a fallen tree, once we find a sign, we track them. We look for where they're holed up. We assess their numbers, then we wait. Once they move, how long will we have? Asked Alex. Ragland reached the spot he'd hidden his backpack. He bent down, strapped it tight over his back, and readjusted the bow on his shoulder. You found them 2 days out, right? If they haven't moved yet, we can maybe thank the snow for that. We'll be 3 on foot against at least 200 of them. I know you estimated 400 to 500, but I don't think they'll all be fighting. Anyway, I figure we can beat them there by half a day. Shit, Alex said under his breath. That's not much time. We might get lucky, said Kit. Maybe they changed their mind after you told them off at the gate. I looked into his eyes, he said. They'll be back. And not just for you or me. Bakerstown is a human meat farm. That'll be too much for them to resist. Marley won't be able to negotiate with them unless it's to sacrifice some of her own people to buy a short reprieve. If she does that, they'll be back again and again for years until there's no one left. How do you know? Alex asked, falling into step with Ragland. Trust me, it's not the first time I've seen... Ragland paused to swallow a bad memory. Just trust me. He noticed Kit and Alex exchange looks before he turned his attention back to their snowy path southeast. They paused for lunch when the sun was high in the sky. Ragland didn't allow them a fire. How far have we come, you think? Kit asked, washing down some jerky with a gulp of water. Ragland shrugged. A few miles. What are we looking for? Anything. Remains of a campfire, blood, bones. Come on, let's get moving. I want to make camp at sundown. They tromped for 4 hours until the afternoon light began to dim. Ragland began to look for a good spot to make camp. Concentrating, he almost missed the whisper of shock from Kit. To him, it had sounded like a bird on the wind. Kit repeated the words, only louder. Oh, God. What is it? Ragland stopped their party and frowned. She was as pale as the snow on the ground, her eyes staring between the sparse trees at the crest of a low hill a few hundred yards distant. Ragland's blood chilled, and he was thankful when Alex grabbed Kit and pulled her close to him, hiding her face from the horror. Stay here, whispered the old man, dropping his backpack and unslinging his bow. He indicated they should hunker down behind a fallen tree. Don't make any noise. Cautiously, Ragland climbed the small incline, using the trees as cover. As he approached the top, he kept his eyes averted from the horror that awaited, and instead surveyed the area for signs of company. The snow was pristine. There were no prints or other signs of recent activity. Satisfied they were alone, he stood up to full height and climbed the rest of the way, finally giving his full attention to the unfortunate soul he found there. The body was that of a young man, nailed through the wrists to a rough pole that had been staked into the ground. He had been flayed and gutted, strips of muscle cut from the legs and arms. There was nothing clean or symbolic about the scene. It was just a brutal butchering. Both the nose and ears had been removed, no doubt as mementos. It was also a warning, intentional or not, that they were not the only ones hunting. Cannibals, he murmured when he got back to Kit and Alex. We need to move. Figured, said Alex. Does that mean their camp is near? I don't think so, Ragland replied. I didn't see any signs that there had been more than a handful. Maybe it was just a hunting party. Kit pulled away from Alex's chest, a hand to her mouth. Holy shit, she said. What the fuck? Ragland couldn't agree more with the sentiment. You're not going to like a theory I have, the old man grumbled, hands on his hips like Marley as his eyes scanned the woods. Kit looked at Alex, who looked at Ragland. Just tell us. Fine, Ragland said. I think it's possible they anticipated something like our mission and that they are out hunting. What? Kit gasped. No, that's not possible, right? We'd have seen or heard them. Maybe not. After all, they probably don't know who they are hunting for, just that someone is looking for them. We can't underestimate them, and we have to assume that they'll find our tracks, in which case they will be hunting us. So what are you saying? Kit said. That these cannibals are sophisticated? Ragland nodded. You saw the man at the gate, and Alex also spied on them at camp. They're not all brain surgeons, but they are being led by the norms. Cannibals, but cannibals who are intelligent and calculating. Then why have we only just learned about it? God damn, man, this doesn't feel right. Ragland shrugged. Well, no offense, but your town is pretty sheltered and seem to have their worldview shaped by a handful of people who have never been outside the gate. There's more of the Zom, so naturally if your people did encounter them, they probably never saw the hierarchy up close. Right. Kit shuffled from Alex's arms and straightened her backpack. So, she said, what signs did you find? Were they here recently? Could we track them? The reply caught him off guard. Kit surprised him more and more. Bakerstown was lucky to have her. Then he smiled. The body is well and truly cold. I think it's been at least 24 hours. That means they could still be close, so we have to be on high alert. Kit shuddered at the thought. I did find one print in the dirt under a pine. It was headed north. North it is then, I guess, Alex said, putting his arm around Kit's shoulders again. Ragland nodded. North. Chapter 3. Ragland felt the possibility of being hunted was in some twisted way a little poetic. He'd spent so long in the New World being a hunter that he'd almost forgotten what it had been like to be prey, but it had happened before. Having seen out the period after the infection until the Chinese army was driven back across the Appalachians by the retrovirus, the young survivors alone and hungry without any form of government or authority had scattered or banded together. Some of those groups were savage, killing at will over food or territory. For a time, Ragland thought that was how it would be forever, but then during his travels he heard of a stronghold in Albany, New York, where rumor had it, the son of the last president ruled. Doubting the veracity of the rumor, but tired of being on edge and avoiding the gangs of marauding teenagers, Ragland decided some order was what he needed, and set out for Albany. He didn't know what he'd find, but there was nothing else for him. He traveled as inconspicuously as possible, mostly at night and on back roads, but avoiding people altogether was impossible. Because he was alone, he was often assessed by opportunity seekers to be an easy target. Sometimes he could avoid conflict, but sometimes it was inevitable. One such incident had taken place 3 miles from the border of New York, when 3 straggly teenagers armed with blades and axes had confronted him. I killed all 3 of them, Ragland said as he stoked their campfire on the 3rd night. The first time I took a human life, and I had to take 3. I never arrived in Albany. I decided after that incident that it was best to avoid people altogether. And that's when I began wandering. They'd found a small cave-like structure which sheltered them enough from the wind and helped hide the fire, though not entirely. It was a risk, but extinguishing it for complete stealth would ensure they wouldn't wake up in the morning. Alex and Kit sat opposite him on an old log, sticks of squirrel meat forgotten in their hands. How old were you? Kit asked. I was about 25 or 26. I can't recall exactly. The early years kind of blend into one. Kit hung her head. I might beat that, Gramps. I'm not even 20, but I might have blood on my hands before Christmas. It's so screwed up. It is, Ragland nodded. There's no good age when it comes to killing. But if you're doing it for the right reason, and only when you need to, then it's righteous, I guess. Do you think I'll be able to go through with it when the time comes? She asked. He paused a minute and pondered the question while he chewed squirrel meat. You have it in you. Most do. It's just a matter of time and circumstance. Alex raised his eyebrows. Man, that's a bit dark. Ragland shrugged. Maybe, but it's true. Maybe if things hadn't turned out like they did with you getting on the radar, it might have been different. A gloomy mood fell over the camp for the rest of the night. Once they'd eaten and set traps, Ragland put out the fire and they took to their tents and slept. Ragland dreamt he was wandering through Bakerstown. The streets were filled with corpses that he couldn't avoid stepping on. Every now and then in the mess he would see a familiar face. Simon, Marley, Jack the Butcher, Erica. He had a sinking feeling in the pit of his stomach. Where was Kit? Finally he saw the school in the distance and knew this was where he would find her. His foot squelched on something, and when he looked down he saw Claire's face under the sole of his boot. In horror he lurched away towards the school, only to find there was a tree in front where none had been before. It was a tall cedar, and pinned to it with arrows was Kit. She was facing him, her mouth open in a silent scream, her eyes bloody sockets. Ragland sat bolt upright. Panting heavily, he scrambled out of his tent on hands and knees and took in gulps of fresh, cold air. "You okay?" Ragland brushed his long hair away from his eyes and saw Alex already awake, checking on his backpack. Ashamed to be caught in such a vulnerable state, he climbed to his feet. "Fine," he growled. Alex nodded with a doubtful look on his face, and went back to packing. The nightmare set the tone for Ragland's day, and, in a foul mood, he tore his tent down a little impatiently and stuffed it into his pack. He was ready to move when Kit surfaced. "About time," he barked. "Jesus," she yawned and rubbed her eyes before moving out of the way as Alex wordlessly began to pull down their own tent. "Relax, Gramps, I'm up, aren't I?" "Barely. Get your shit packed and let's go." Ragland turned his back, not wanting to see Kit and Alex exchange looks or whisper their opinions. Instead, he took a short northward walk away from the camp and waited. After just 5 minutes, the pair appeared on either side of him. Kit's eyes softened when she saw Ragland's face. He looked older this morning, the faint lines on his face a little more noticeable, his eyes haunted. "Sorry about before," she said, even though she'd done nothing. "I had a nightmare. It was pretty frickin' bad." Ragland's eyes widened, but he had no intention of mentioning his own bad dream. "Forget it. We're all tired and cold. Let's just keep going. We can't be far now." The land they walked became an incline, easy at first, but then steeper until it led up a hill to a sharp crest. The branches thinned and the ground started to level out near the summit, and they slowed to catch their breath before eventually reaching it. "Wow," Ragland said. "Beautiful." "Yeah," Kit replied. "Seriously awesome." From the crest, the land sloped down into a small valley. It was steeper than the other side and treeless, but not impassable. From their vantage, they overlooked snow-covered treetops for as far as the eye could see. Alex was silent, but when Ragland checked on him, he saw the kid was appreciating the vista as much as he and Kit. Only, he wasn't really a kid. Neither was Kit. Not kids like they would have been before the fall. Still, he couldn't think of them any other way, and because of that, he felt a responsibility to keep them safe. The nightmare was probably a manifestation of the weight of that responsibility, but its effects had faded as their hike progressed. Now a sense of empathy washed over him like a gust of warm air. It served to focus him on the task at hand. They started down the hill and were still 200 feet from entering the trees when Alex stopped and pointed into the distance. "Look there. Is that smoke?" Ragland squinted and could make out a thin white plume masked by the glare of a low sun on the horizon. It was hard to see, but Alex had caught it. "Good spotting," Ragland said and thumped him on the shoulder. "Very good eyes." Alex beamed and Kit stood on tiptoes and kissed him on the cheek. "Nice work, babe." The adoration on her face struck Ragland, and he knew it wasn't just puppy love, but a real thing the two shared. Kids like these would be the future, and he felt more than ever that he had to keep them alive. "Right," Ragland said. "This is where we need to be extra careful. This is a recon only, no engagement, no heroic shit, got it?" The pair nodded. "Good." "So, what are we going to do for evidence, then? Get close, sketch a picture, and show the town we were right?" Kit offered. Alex chuckled, and Ragland allowed himself the ghost of a grin at her humor. "If only that would work. Sure do miss my old smartphone." Alex and Kit looked blankly at him. "Forget it. We're going to get something they can't ignore, a count of their numbers, maybe evidence of their ferocity." "A hostage, right?" said Alex. "No," Ragland said. "Too dangerous. We're going to get ourselves a trophy." "A trophy? What, like we cut off one of their heads and take it back?" Kit asked. "No, Jesus, kid. If you people had tech, I'd say you were watching too much TV. No, not a head. We're going for one of their necklaces." Kit looked confused and touched her pendant. "Oh," Alex said. "You mean the ears. The string of ears they make from the ones they cut off their victims." Kit's face paled. "Sorry," said Alex. It's sick, she said, and took a deep breath. Why do they do it? Why do you think? Ragland rasped, checking his bow and securing it back onto his shoulder. Tallying their kills? Trophies? Both. Let's go. The three began their careful descent down into the trees and turned in the direction they'd seen the plume of smoke. Once in the trees, the sense of danger set in and prickled at the hairs on his arms the deeper into the forest they went. They all stumbled a few times, the deep snow hiding the roots and rocks in their path. After an hour, they came to a freshly trodden path. The snow and mud had been trampled by many feet and swung in a slightly northwesterly direction. Kit shot Ragland a look of trepidation. The cannibals were moving in the direction of Bakerstown. There must be hundreds of them, Alex said, kneeling down to inspect the footprints. Yes, said Ragland. I'd say it's the bulk of the group you saw on your scouting mission, but not all of them. Is there still time? Said Kit in a strident voice. To get ahead and raise the alarm? I don't know, Ragland said, but 3 of us can move quicker than hundreds. He unslung his bow and broke into a light jog. Come on. Chapter 4. By nightfall, Ragland, Kit, and Alex had caught up with the cannibals, who had set up camp. They were now near the northern boundary of the former national forest they'd been walking through, and the problem soon would be the open land beyond. 10 years had not been long enough for the forest to claim back the former farmland and roads it gave way to. Once out of the forest, they would be more exposed to the weather and at risk of being spotted by the cannibals they followed. When they had the location of the camp, they moved a mile away and set up their own camp in a dry creek bed sheltered by a steep bank. Clustered tightly around a small fire, Ragland passed around morsels of the small rabbit he'd shot an hour before they stumbled upon the cannibal camp. They made short work of the meat. Do either of you know these parts? Both shook their heads. Not really. Kit shivered as she bunched up close to Alex. I haven't been this way before, he said, but I suspect it will be bloody cold as we'll be a bit more exposed. It will. I'd hoped to be much further south by now if things had, he glanced at Kit, been different. But winter this year has surprised. He reached over for another stick to throw on the fire and grimaced, holding his lower back for a minute. You okay? Alex asked. Yeah, he said, thankful that the glow of the fire hid his red face. I know I might be old to you, but I'm still in my prime. I'm just exhausted. We all are. You grab some shut-eye, I'll take first watch. Ragland shook his head, earning him frowns from the other two. Not me, kids. I've got to get us that necklace. Kit sat up straight. Like hell you are, Gramps. Are you frigging insane? You think you're just going to waltz on in, all howdy and stuff, and just grab a spare necklace of ears? Ragland couldn't help but smile. She was a little more cantankerous than his sister had been, but not by too much. The reminder cheered him up. No, they'll be settling down for the night, but there'll be some out and about foraging or scouting. I plan to find one of those and take them quietly. I'm coming with you. No, Alex, you're not. But, no, he barked as he reached for his pack. You stay here and keep Kit safe. The girl bristled and he quickly corrected. Keep each other safe. Make sure to keep the fire as low as you can. Before I go, though, I need something to pep me up. Kit was scowling as he pulled a tiny pouch and what looked like a small steel pot from his backpack. While they watched, he poured the contents of the pouch into the pot and topped it with water. While he couldn't make out what the dark powdery substance was by the low light, Alex smelled it immediately. You have coffee? Ragland nodded. Simon had a small supply left in his pantry and gifted me some. He must like you, Kit said softly, her scowl somewhat softened. Coffee's mad rare. We only get some of it because of the long trade journey Marley sends south every spring. Not surprised, Ragland replied as he held the pot over the flames. Without a percolator or filter, he'd been told to boil it and filter through a small mesh paper Simon had given him. He poured the coffee through the filter into his tin cup, and did so for Kit and Alex, too. Then he raised his steaming cup to theirs. Here's to, he started. Coffee, Kit finished for him, and taking a big gulp. She grimaced in pain as the hot liquid burnt her mouth, but managed not to spit any out before it was down. Damn, that was hot, she said through watering eyes, and then she blew furiously trying to cool it quicker. Alex laughed and shook his head. Hot or not, she threw hers down while they were still sipping their way through theirs. Done, she placed the cup down, closed her eyes, and let out a long breath. God, I love that shit. Yeah, Ragland said. I can tell. Maybe let it cool a little next time so you can actually taste it. He finished his a few minutes later, and as he stood up, he could already feel the caffeine kicking in. Okay, you two. Stay put, keep warm, but keep the fire low. I won't be long. They nodded. Are you taking your bow? No, Kit, this calls for stealth, and the less I carry, the better. My knife is all I need. She nodded, but didn't look convinced. Back soon. Don't die, said Alex, immediately regretting his choice of words. Kit thumped him. Ragland moved off into the trees without comment. 20 minutes later, he was within 100 yards of the cannibal camp. They were just beyond the edge of the forest, sheltered from the worst of the weather. Crouched low in the darkness of the forest, he rubbed his hands to keep the circulation going. He watched and surveyed the camp just like he had before rescuing Kit the first time. It was big and well run. It had to be for them to be able to move so many people in such an organized fashion. Thankfully, it didn't look to be the full population Alex and his spies had found. This group looked to be about 150, but from what he could see, they were armed to the teeth. This, then, was their army. As ramshackle and rudely armed as it was, he hadn't seen a large fighting group like it since the Chinese Red Army had departed. Not good. The plume of warm breath faded like a ghost in the cold darkness. He would have no hope of just sneaking into the camp to find what he wanted. His only option, as he'd mentioned to Alex and Kit, was to wait for an individual or small band to break off and enter the woods to forage or take a piss. That would be his move. But even now he was doubting that obtaining the trophy and taking it back would convince the people of Bakerstown they were in imminent danger. The longer he sat there in the cold, the more he began to think it was nothing more than a harebrained scheme. No, Bakerstown would only fight if the threat was bashing down their gates. Literally. If they didn't wake up and defeat or at least fight the cannibals to a standstill, they would only grow stronger and like a plague move on to the next town, and the next, and the next. Much more was at stake than Bakerstown. He was on the verge of calling the mission off and thinking about how to explain it to Kit and Alex when he spied a pair of cannibals saunter away from the firelight into the woods and only 100 feet from his position. These two were dressed in decent winter gear and didn't have the shuffling appearance of zombs. As he moved through the trees, rounding their position to come up behind them, he did spy a group of zombs, their ankles chained one to the next, with the two on each end secured to trees. These were ugly and malnourished, almost unrecognizable as human beings, and he realized with shock that the two Norms were guarding them. Were they deliberately starving them? The inhumanity of it hit him hard, but it was when he deduced why that he felt sick to the stomach. Shock troops. They would unleash this group first, and crazed with hunger and whatever treatment they'd endured their whole lives, they would rampage through the streets of Bakerstown like a mobile meat grinder. With a fresh resolve, Ragland found the two men laughing and swearing as they emptied their bladders side by side. He lunged at the one on the right, burying the knife into the back of his neck and severing his spinal cord, ripping it out as he grabbed the second in a headlock and clamped a hand over his mouth. The cannibal struggled and thrashed around as he tried to escape Ragland's grip. He couldn't, and inevitably the drifter's blade opened the exposed skin of his throat, unleashing a gout of crimson. Ragland held him until it was over, then let the body crumple next to his pissing buddy. Taking a quick breather, he rolled them both over and cursed. Neither wore a string of ears. It was a good time to turn around and head back to the others, but something about what he'd seen stung him deeper than he could explain. And now, cocky from the easy kill and just for the bloody hell of it, he wanted to get one up on the bastards, by sneaking into their camp and stealing something from right under their nose. He looked down at the bodies and a grim smile slowly dawned on his face. 5 minutes later, with bloody stripes painted on each of his cheeks and wearing the white coat he'd stripped from cannibal number 1, he sheathed his knife and walked confidently toward the camp, holding the small axe his victim had been carrying loosely in one hand. Chapter 5. Ragland cast furtive glances as he went, but no one seemed to have noticed him yet. A razor-sharp focus, courtesy of the adrenaline coursing through his system, had kicked in. He would find a necklace, put it around his neck, and then get the hell out of Dodge. He was heading into a quieter part of the camp when a heavy hand fell on his shoulder. "What's that trinket you gone found yourself there, brother?" Ragland was silent for a moment, searching his brain for a response that wouldn't get him killed. "Hey, fuckhead! I just asked you a question." The hand was joined by another, and Ragland found himself spun around and looking up into the face of a gigantic, bald man. Recognition washed over Ragland. He knew this gigantic savage from somewhere. The giant's eyes narrowed. "Found it out in the woods," Ragland said, holding up the axe. "Oh yeah? Whose blood is that?" Ragland shrugged. "Don't know, but it sure tastes sweet," he said, raising the axe blade and licking some of the cannibal blood from the edge. The big cannibal stared at him a little longer before cracking a laugh. Other cannibals stepped forward, curious about the conversation. Ragland, nauseous at the coppery taste in his mouth, wished he was back up behind the hill with Kid and Alex. "You must be hungry to be licking cold blood off a blade." The cannibal slapped him on the shoulder and moved off. "Don't worry, you'll get your fill of meat when we take that town." Ragland watched him go as the feral cannibals chained up to the trees heard meat and began to shriek the word over and over. He barely noticed because it had dawned on him where he knew the face from. This man was the living, breathing image of the gigantic Zom he had killed the first time he left Bakerstown. Gigantic twins. One a mindless freak, then this specimen who was even more terrifying because of his ability to think and speak. Ragland focused on controlling his breathing as the others around him dispersed or followed the giant. Subdued by this interaction, he went back to scouting the camp when he noticed ahead another face he knew. The man he had turned away from the gate of Bakerstown a few days before. The leader. He was laughing and drinking with more Norms, including females, and greeted the giant loudly when he entered the firelight. "Moose, where have you been?" "Taking a dump, boss." This was greeted with howls of laughter. Ragland tarried just a second too long, and the eyes of the leader fell on him before moving back to his circle of buddies. Cursing quietly, the drifter pulled down his hood and ducked into the shadow of a tree, waiting for a shout of alarm. He counted to 10, and none came. When he felt safe, he slipped out of sight down a path between two lines of tents. He came to another open area, this one not as boisterous or populated as the last, and began weaving through sleeping bodies. Spooked by the too close encounters, he was about to call time on this particular mission and begin to make his way out of camp, when he spied, draped over a stick wedged into the frozen ground, a necklace of ears. A lot of them. He paused and listened, then glanced left and right before reaching up and taking the trinket. The ears, mostly shrunken and darkened with age, were frozen solid, like rocks to touch. At one end were two fresher additions, blood still congealed at the edges where they'd been severed from their owner's head. The tops of the ears had been pierced and a thin wire threaded through them before being joined in a tight knot. It was one of the more gruesome things he had ever seen. Now that he had it, he was unwilling to put it over his head, and instead shoved it inside of his coat. He looked up and for the first time noticed that he was being watched. It was a girl of about 7 sitting by a small fire. Her dark eyes were fixed on him. That awful, empty gaze spooked him more than the necklace of dead flesh, but he maintained his composure. "Just getting it for him," he bluffed. She didn't say a word, just kept on staring at him, eyes unblinking. A Zom. Too simple in the head to even understand he was talking to her. Ragland licked his lip and looked past her. Just one fire ahead, and beyond its glow he could see the long stretch of trees that would lead him back to his companions. Ragland took a deep breath and started walking. He'd barely taken 10 paces when a figure stepped from the shadows and blocked his path. "Hello, brother." It was the leader. He wore a winter jacket, jeans, and boots. Ragland thought that if it wasn't for the carving in his forehead, the cannibal could have easily blended in with the Bakerstown folk. As Ragland tried to find a way out of the situation he found himself in, he spotted movement in the shadows on both sides. Guards, who no doubt would block his escape. "There's nothing you can say that will help you, friend. I never forget a face," the leader said, as he crossed his arms behind his back. "What brings you to our camp?" Ragland didn't speak. Instead, he turned and lunged for freedom, only to come crashing into the chest of Moose. "No you don't, little lamb," the giant cannibal said, grasping his upper arm and holding him in front of the leader. A cold deeper than the winter's night chilled Ragland. This was it. He'd walked right into the lion's den and offered himself up as a free meal. The leader stepped forward slowly and reached out, unzipping Ragland's jacket. There, he slid his cold, long-fingered hand in and plucked free the necklace of ears. "Oh dear! What is this, friend?" Ragland remained silent. "No? Well, no matter." Ragland struggled against Moose's grip, but the big man clamped down tight enough to make him wince. The leader and a few of his friends laughed. The feral cannibals at the trees screamed meat in a blood-curdling chorus. The leader raised his hands into the air, his sharpened teeth glinting in the firelight. "Yes, meat, my pretties!" The chorus died away, and the leader rubbed his chin in a thoughtful manner. "My loyal pack always speak true. It's our tradition, our way of life. Meat. The best kind of meat. And you come to us on the eve of our greatest feast yet. An appetizer. Confirmation of our righteous path. Thank you, stranger, for this gift." He grabbed Ragland's chin and inspected him, pinching his cheeks and prodding his body. "Lean, but you'll do," the leader said, and signaled Moose before walking past them and back towards his campfire. Ragland found himself lifted from the ground and hoisted over the giant's shoulder like a small child being carried by its father. Ragland struggled as they followed the leader, but the grip of the gigantic cannibal was unshakable. Near the fire, the leader motioned to a tree. 3 minutes later, he was tied securely to the rough bark of the trunk. Triumphant, the leader came over to Ragland and licked his bottom lip slowly as his gray eyes bored into him. "What's your name, meat?" "Go fuck yourself." The leader howled with laughter, then punched Ragland in the jaw. The sharp pain was accompanied by a flash of white that filled his vision momentarily, then his mouth filled with blood. Disoriented from the blow, he spat out a globule of blood. "Let's try that again. What is your name?" Feeling as if it was already over, Ragland didn't see what he had to lose, so he smiled through the blood. "Go fuck." The second punch was somehow harder. It crunched into his lower jaw, flung his head to the side, and Ragland felt a tooth come loose. Raising his head, he adjusted his position against the tree and worked his tongue along his back teeth. Sure enough, a molar had broken off. He spat it at the leader's feet. "Ah, trophy, thank you." The leader picked up the tooth and, smiling, put it into his coat pocket. "I'm going to enjoy eating you. Perhaps we'll fillet and cook you while you watch." He plucked a hunting knife from his belt and took a step towards Ragland when a howl sounded from the woods opposite, followed by a whoosh and flames flaring up amongst the trees. The leader spun around, distracted by the commotion. "Moose, get everyone you have," he ordered, before stepping up to Ragland and putting his face mere inches away. "Don't go anywhere, my sweet meat." Ragland watched him run off with the rest of his baying troops and looked around. His knife was on the ground, well out of reach. He craned his neck to check the woods to the left, and in his peripheral vision spotted a shadow racing up behind him. There came a thud and a panting breath as fingers began to fumble at the rope. "Fuck, fuck, fuck," a voice rasped. "Kit? We've got to go. Alex said he'd delay them as long—" Her voice broke and she fell silent. After nearly a full minute of fumbling and slicing, the ropes fell to the ground. Ragland bent over and grabbed his knife before joining Kit behind the tree. She stood up, her eyes wide with fear, and handed him his backpack. He took it and slung it over his shoulders before taking the bow. "Where's Alex?" Kit shook her head. "He didn't give me a choice." He gripped her by the shoulders. "Where?" Tears rolled down her face as she pushed him off, her eyes glowing in the orange firelight. He's... A shout interrupted them, and Ragland spun around to see 2 cannibals speeding towards them. Taking out his knife, he told Kit to run. "I'll be right behind you." Throwing the knife from his right hand into his left, he ducked under the punch of the first cannibal and sliced him across the stomach. Ragland met the second cannibal head-on, knocking his knife-wielding hand away and sticking his own blade deep into the cannibal's eye socket. His shriek of agony pierced the night. Cries erupted, the leader's louder than the rest. "Back to the fire! Our meat is escaping!" The blood-curdling chorus of the Zom cannibals screaming for meat again rose up, drowning out everything else. The cannibal with the open belly had turned, unaware that his guts were spilling onto the snow, and came at him again. Ragland sliced his throat this time, and was gone before the body hit the frozen earth. Chapter 6. Ragland and Kit dashed into the woods, their pace as hard and as fast as they could, the bloodthirsty horde behind them proving plenty of incentive. Ragland deliberately had them running deeper into the forest, but after 10 minutes they arced towards the north. Miraculously, the screams and yells behind them fell off and continued west, the cannibals clearly not skilled at tracking. "I think we lost them," said Kit, panting hard at the exertion. "We keep going," said Ragland. "Once we're out of the forest, we'll reevaluate." 20 minutes later, they emerged into a field where hard gusts of wind cut through their clothes like they were nothing. "Keep going!" Ragland roared over the noise of the storm. His hand pointed toward a row of abandoned houses. Their feet sunk into the fresh snow as deep as their knees in some places. Behind them, the glow of fire reflected across the field. Ragland glanced over his shoulder and cursed. Not as poor at tracking as he thought, although it was only a small group. There were shouts when they were spotted, and he saw 2 split off and head back the way they had come. They would summon the rest. Lungs on fire, Ragland helped Kit up over a fence and kicked in the back door of a house. Inside, out of the wind, Ragland ran through the kitchen to the living room. He tore a length of curtain off, wrapped it around his hand, and punched the big plate glass window. Immediately, great flurries of snow filled the room. Ragland took the glass pieces and rushed to the back door and started to wedge them upright between the floorboards. "What are you doing?" Kit shivered, the strength and energy gone from her voice. Leaving Alex to the cannibals and the seeming inevitability of their own capture and death was too much for the young girl to handle. "Buying time. It'll slow some of them down. We need every edge we can get. Come on, let's go." The two were through the front door less than 3 minutes after they entered and back out onto the street, fighting against the wind. They turned into another yard, this one in the row of houses opposite. Ragland vaulted a set of broken steps up to a long porch. Once at the top, he drew back his foot and kicked through the big double front doors of the 2-story home and ran inside. Kit was right behind him, her pants hard and sharp. We can't keep running. We've got to stop this storm." Ragland shook his head, his eyes searching for something to use. Nothing became apparent. "No," he said, and darted into the back room and toward a glass sliding door that led to the back garden. "We have to move." "But the storm! What about Alex?" Ragland turned and grabbed Kit and stared deep into her eyes. "Alex is gone. If we stay or linger, we die too. Our only shot is to keep going all the way back to Bakerstown." "But—" Kit choked, trying to hold back tears. The exhaustion aided in keeping them back. "That's a day's hike." "I know," he said, and let go of her, and looked through the doors toward the woods that backed onto the fenced garden. "But it's the only choice we have right now. Are you ready? We'll make for the trees there and jog up to the next hill." Kit tucked some loose hair back into her beanie and secured her coat. "Ready." In just half an hour, Ragland guessed they'd covered 2 miles. It wasn't record-breaking, but in the conditions it was great progress. For now, they hadn't stumbled and his knees were still in good working order. As the incline eased and swept over toward the top of the valley, they crested and dipped down towards the other side out of sight, then swung hard northwest. Above them, the sky was blotched gray-black, all of the stars hidden from view even though the snowstorm had eased off to a light fall. The distant howls of their pursuers had also dropped off, and as they continued their methodical jog, he began to hope. After another half hour, though, Kit stumbled and clutched at a tree, slowly sliding down until she was sitting on the snow. Ragland doubled back and knelt next to her. "I can't do it," she said in short, harsh pants. "It's too far." "You have to," Ragland begged. In the distance, he fancied he saw a brief wink of light between the trees. Cannibals, or a trick of his eyes. It hardened his resolve. "Come on," he said, and helped Kit back to her feet. "You're stronger than you think." "Alex always said so," she said and wiped her face. "Now he's gone." She started to sag back to the ground, but he took her face in his gloved hands. "Do it for Alex, Kit. Make his sacrifice worth something." She stared as if slapped, and Ragland worried that he'd gone too far. Kit eventually nodded, straightened her beanie, and shook snow off her sleeves. "For Alex." Their dangerous marathon lasted into the early hours, fueled only by nuts and berries and desperation. Finally, the endless night ended when the distant sun broke light across the powdered treetops. Ragland and Kit slowed to a trudging walk, but continued towards home. When they passed a large fallen cedar on an established path, Kit told him they were a half-day away, a reward for their grueling run through the night. They stopped an hour after sunup and ate the last of the rabbit from 2 nights before, washing it down with a few handfuls of snow. Ragland's bones ached and the tip of his nose was numb. He knew without the warm blood pumping through their system from the exertion of the flight they'd both be sporting a bad case of frostbite, or worse. He stood up again and Kit groaned. "Can we rest for just a bit longer?" Kit said, eyes barely open. Ragland turned back and peered into the distance behind them. He spotted a plume of smoke at least 3 miles behind them. "We'll rest for 5 more minutes. I think they are doing the same. It'll give us a chance to put more miles between us and them." She nodded without opening her eyes. He felt more for her then than at any time since he'd met her. She'd just lost her partner, and to compound the agony of the raw grief, she was on the point of exhaustion. He sat close and let her rest her head on his shoulders as they shared their warmth. He didn't even realize he'd fallen asleep until he was startled awake by a gunshot in the distance. He clambered to his feet and helped Kit up, newly energized. "Sorry, I fell asleep," Kit said. "Don't be. Me too. Let's move." Rejuvenated by their meager portions of food and the few minutes shut-eye, Ragland and Kit set off at a jog. After an hour, the regrettable happened, and he fell down hard when a rock he trod on tipped unexpectedly, rolling his ankle. "Shit, are you okay?" Kit said, helping him up. "I think so," he started, and promptly fell to his hands and knees again when his ankle failed to hold. "It's not broken. I think I just sprained it," he said, and began to rise again. Kit held him down. "Let me look." In a flash, she had his boot and sock off, and they inspected the damage. The joint was swollen, but not ridiculously so. Kit wrapped it tight with a bandana she pulled out of her pocket, and he put his sock and boot back on. "Thanks, feels better already," he said after taking a few tentative steps. "But we won't be jogging the rest of the way to Bakerstown." Fine by me, said Kit. Within a mile, Ragland had warmed up completely and barely felt the ankle as long as he maintained a steady walk and didn't try any fancy moves. The last stretch to Bakerstown took the rest of the afternoon, and by the time twilight started to consume the sky, soaking the snow in deep purple, the weary pair were in sight of the gates. 50 yards out, the siren started to blare, and Ragland made out Charlie at the top, his eyes wide. The siren, an old wind-up job, continued blaring, but the gate remained shut. "Open the gate, Charlie," Kit called up to the boy as they came to a pause below the lookout. Now that they arrived, the adrenaline of the chase ebbed, and they both felt the cold and hunger begin to catch up on them. Ragland's ankle began to stiffen, and he used his bow to support his weight. Kit looked at him, and he waved it off. "It's fine, I'm just tired," he said. "What's taking them so fucking long?" The siren began to wind down, and they enjoyed the silence briefly before the faces of Marley, David, and a few others appeared at the top. The gate remained closed. "Where's Alex?" Marley asked, her voice uncharacteristically cold. He... Kit started, but fell to her knees, the emotion she'd been bottling for the last 16 hours spilling out as she bawled into her hands. Before Ragland could finish her sentence, David did. "He's dead, isn't he? Ragland, you son of a bitch, you did it, didn't you?" Marley moved her hand, and the other men on the fence raised their bows as she waited for his answer. "Kit, you move away from him," Marley called. At the end of the line of men, Ragland spotted Rahul, a rifle aimed loosely in his direction. The outrageous accusation, and puzzling over what had changed between David and Marley in their absence, had silenced him momentarily. But Ragland finally found his tongue. "Marley, what the hell's wrong with you?" Ragland said. "It's nothing like that. These two came after me, but we were attacked. They're chasing us now, less than a day behind. They got Alex and they're—" David pulled out a handgun, a big-barreled revolver, and pointed it at him. It seemed to come as a shock to Marley, her hand fluttering to her mouth. Whatever had changed between them, it was easy to see that David had more power or some hold over her that he didn't have before. "Bullshit," said David as he cocked the weapon. "I'm going to end you right here." "David," said Marley. Ragland knew the look in David's eyes and knew there was no way he'd be talked down. There was only one thing for it. As quick as a snake, Ragland drew his hunting knife, and in one movement grabbed Kit and pulled her to her feet as he stepped behind her, his blade against the pale skin of her throat. He swiveled her from side to side, making sure anyone thinking of taking a shot would think twice. Kit went limp and held her hands out as people assembled on the gate cried out in shock, a hostage showing she was cooperating. He knew she understood what he was doing and why, but the act of last resort still left a bitter taste in his mouth. He looked up at David. "Let me in or I finish her right here." The end of Episode 5. This has been The Drifter, an America Falls novel, Episode 5, Eye of the Storm. Written by Scott Medbury. Narrated by Mike Manns.